So, welcome to week 7. My comments and reflections. You guys had great journal entries this week. They're getting a little longer and a little more detailed, and I appreciate that. Again, giving those examples is what helps me know what you're thinking about. They were very thoughtful. You gave options. I might read aloud to a small group, but not the whole class. I might read aloud one-on-one. I might start the chapter reading aloud and then have the students go read in their lit circles. And so the fact that you're thinking through the different times when you would or would not shows me that you're reading and comprehending the Tompkins text and then the Holland Motes text. You also gave personal anecdotes, which I enjoyed, listening to when teachers bored you and you wanted to fall asleep, and then teachers who inspired you by how well they read aloud. I was that teacher who enjoyed reading aloud to the point that I would start acting out the stories and embarrass my students, and they would beg me to stop. And then most of you focused on question 2, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. What I didn't see mentioned very often, which is fine, I'm just going to bring these out for you, these ideas. Reading aloud can be enjoyable for you as a teacher as well as your students, and that is not to be discounted. If you are having a good day, then your students are going to have a good day. I mean, not 100%, but when you're in a good mood, that definitely helps your students be in a good mood as well, because you're not going to be as irritable in February when it's been raining for 3 straight days. So read aloud when you feel like you need a break, and I think your students will appreciate that spontaneity. You also, some of you mentioned ELL. Listening for your English language learners, if they listen to you read aloud, it might help with their pronunciation or their vocabulary. And remember that there's expressive and receptive vocabulary. And so listening to you is going to be the receptive. So when you have them listen to you, you might then ask them questions that encourage them to use those words that they've then just heard. So yes, it's going to help, but it's not going to be the only thing that helps. Not many of you mentioned the time of year when you would consider reading aloud to students. And so just to point out that that could be a consideration, you might start off the year doing more read alouds and then pull back towards the end of the year. You might start off end of the year, do a lot of middle of the year when your students still have a lot of energy doing some independent work, and then at the end of the year when you're all exhausted and worrying about tests, go back to reading out loud to give your students a break. And so the time of your lessons can play a role into how you construct them and what you think is best. And so just keep that in consideration. And then no one mentioned that Holland Motes sounds just like Holland Oates, and I thought that that was really funny, and it made me laugh every time I read that. I just giggle a little bit. So the questions, you guys for the most part talked about question 2, and it was fine. You could pick any question you wanted. But question 1, discuss how teaching students the different features and structures of fiction text aids in comprehension. And some of that is plot diagram. You know, when you're talking about in the beginning is when you often learn the setting of a story, and then you have a lot of things happen. There's going to be some kind of problem, and then there's often going to be a solving of that problem. And just to give you an example that I ran into yesterday, I tutor with Athens Tutoring, and I was reading a graphic novel, the new Ms. Marvel, which is supposed to be just fantastic, with a male student. And I was actually surprised that he wanted to read that with me. But he loves Marvel. And he said, if you knew me, you'd know I love Marvel. And I was like, oh, okay, thanks. I'm getting to know you. But the main character, who's a young lady, she's from Pakistan, she disobeyed her parents and went off to a party and ended up walking off alone. And I said, "Oh, what do you think is going to happen next?" He said, and my young man said, "Oh, she's going to get her superpowers." I was like, "How do you know that?" And he said, "Well, I mean, it's obvious." So he couldn't really tell me why he knew that, but he knew that this is the time in the story when the main character wanders off on her own, that something is going to happen. And that's because he's read these stories before and he's watched these cartoons before, and that gives him this pattern. So even students that you're not sure are seeing those patterns probably are if you find the text that they're reading on a regular basis. And then this one, discuss how teaching students the different features and structures of expository text aids in comprehension. The reason I think that is so important is especially in middle school, our social studies and science teachers and even math teachers don't always, and I'm not saying that this is, none of them think about this, but they don't always think about specifically teaching students about headings, the index, the glossary, bold words. They just assume that students come to them knowing this. And some students do, and some students don't. When you're in elementary school, taking the time to teach your students this structure is very, very valuable. One of the things I like to do was have a scavenger hunt in the library where I had a bunch of books out on the table and I would give them a list of things they had to find in these books. And you could scaffold that as much or as little as possible, but they had to find a heading and tell me what page it was on and what book it was in, and a specific word in a glossary, and they had to show me what an index was. They had to show me what a subheading was. And again, it was just a fun way to get them involved in learning those different text features. But something else that goes with text structures and text features is description, problem solution, compare, contrast, cause and effect, and sequence. And I was actually had a young man who was he's in 7th grade, and he was working on this in 7th grade. So it's not too young. Elementary school is not too young to talk about these things, but this is a great sheet that talks about some of the signal words, and there are other sheets out there that have the same thing. This one I liked because it gave the graphics to help you. You might have to explain dominoes and comparing apples to oranges, but this is a great sheet, and you can see down here where it's from. So things to think about that I saw in your posts. One, I personally am not a fan of popcorn. And the reason is because having worked with special ed students, they can really have a lot of anxiety about suddenly being called on to read out loud, to the point that they sort of disappear and go to the bathroom or have to go to the nurse when it's time for that. And so if you're going to do popcorn reading or any kind of reading where you're calling on people to read aloud or having other students call, I would avoid the other students calling, because that becomes a big popularity contest or a bullying situation. But if you're going to call on students, consider giving some of your students a predetermined passage. So you could just hand them a little post-it note that says, I'm going to ask you to read the second paragraph on page 32. And that gives them a chance to read ahead. If there's a parapro nearby, they could ask the parapro questions. The parapro could know to go stand sort of in the proximity in case they have a stumbling time with that when they're reading. It could be a smaller section. You could make sure that they got the smaller paragraph coincidentally. But students will really appreciate having that anxiety pulled away from them. And except for when they're practicing, they will stay focused because they want to be prepared when their time comes up. Not up as in dying, but when it's their time to read. And then if they aren't going to pay attention, I mean, you haven't lost anything. So I would give that a try and that a consideration. Audiobooks, some of you mentioned that audiobook can be really boring. I have found that audiobooks can be also fabulous because they allow you to walk around and conference with students. Or pull students out for a few minutes to work with them on certain fluency issues that you have. So if you've got a parapro in the room who may not be comfortable reading out loud, but you have an audiobook going, you could sit there and conference with certain students or do a fluency test. You could also stop the book and ask questions. And sometimes they have absolutely fabulous readers. And then, of course, you can mix and match. You can read some out loud and then have a student read out loud because they want to, and then go back to you reading out loud. And so you don't have to do just one option when you're considering reading out loud. And so I think that was it. I've kept it to about 11 minutes. I'm really excited to look at your midterms. I'll be grading them over spring break. And I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but we are halfway through the course. And if you want to go and fill out that survey, remember it's confidential. If you want me to reply to something, you're welcome to put your name. But if you need to tell me that you need something changed in your course, and if I'm willing to do it, I'm happy to get that feedback. And take care and have a great rest of your week.